Assalamu alaikum everyone. So today we are going to learn how to measure length. Now measuring length is a very simple idea. The thing is that when you are measuring length, you have a lot of different instruments, like let's say for example you have vernier caliper, you have micrometer, screw gauge, measuring tape, and you may have meter rule as well. All right, and then you have a lot of different types of lengths, such as you have radius, height, thickness, circumference, so on and so forth. And generally it's not possible to measure every type of length using every type of instruments. So let's say for example you want to measure, so you have some pieces of paper right here. All right, so you want to measure the length using a meter rule, you're good. You want to measure the width using a meter rule, that's cool. But if I ask you to measure the thickness of this paper using a meter rule, you won't be able to, right? Likewise, I've measured a circular object. So let's say for example you have the circular object in front of you. Again, I've mentioned a pipe, but I don't have a pipe available, so I'm using this rather. So you can measure the length or the height using a meter rule, yes. But can I measure the circumference? That's a no. All right, so I cannot measure the circumference using a plain simple meter rule. Again, so you have different instruments that can be used in to measure different types of lengths, but also each instrument has its own different accuracy. All right, so let's say for example you have a micrometer screw gauge, which is a very accurate instrument, but you cannot use it everywhere. All right, and then you have meter rules, all right, which are very less accurate, but again those are the most available instruments. So usually most measurements that you take for length or any type of length are using a meter rule. All right, so that's something that you need to remember. So how do we determine the accuracy? The accuracy is determined by the smallest division that an instrument has. So what's the smallest division? So smallest division is the smallest measurement that an instrument can make. So let's say for example you have this meter rule in front of you. Now it's not a meter rule. Why? Because it's only 30 centimeters long, but again I cannot put a 100 centimeter long diagram over here, so I had to put this one. But if you look at it, the smallest division of this and the meter rule is exactly the same. It's 1 millimeter. So if I want to measure, let's say for example 0.3 or 0.4 millimeter, I cannot do that accurately using a meter rule. Now what's the maximum length that you can measure using a meter rule? Well, meter rule is the maximum length is 1 meter, but technically you can bypass that. How? You can just keep several meter rules side by side and maybe measure lengths more than 100 centimeters or 1 meter using a meter rule. But the problem with that is that when, let's say for example you have multiple meter rules side by side, there may be some gaps like we have over here, which can give you an inaccurate reading. There's this dead space, there's this dead space over here, which again can give you an inaccurate reading. So there are several problems that you can run into. Of course you can solve them by being careful, but still it's a hassle. All right, so meter rule, smallest division is 1 millimeter, maximum length is technically 1 meters, but you can bypass that. So what are the advantages and disadvantages? An advantage of using a meter rule is that it's very cheap and readily available. It's easy to manufacture. Disadvantages: number one, readings disappear over time. So let's say for example you can look for a very old straight rule that you might have, either made of plastic or steel. You'll see that the readings have weared out. The markings and the readings, they've disappeared. Why? Because again, after use, those readings disappear. Edges wear out over time. So 0 is at the very left edge of the meter rule, and over time it wears out, so you won't be able to measure the whole 100 centimeters using the meter rule. Readings can vary slightly between manufacturers. So let's say for example you take this piece of paper, you take several different meter rules and you measure. Every meter rule is going to be slightly different reading. Again, that's not a big deal, but still, it's scientifically speaking it is, but in practical purposes it's really not. The difference is not that much. Then you can of course only measure straight lengths. So let's say, for example, you have these three lengths in front of you. Of course, the length over here would be this, the length over here would be this, and the length over here would be this. So which can you measure accurately using a meter rule? Of course, the first one. You cannot measure accurately the second one using a meter rule. Why? Because it's curved. And the third one, why? Because it's not uniform. Okay, so I hope that all of this about a meter rule has made sense. Now, after meter rule, you have a vernier caliper. Now, you do not need to know how to use a vernier caliper. You just need to know where it's used and how accurate it is. So you have a vernier caliper right here. These are the upper jaws. All right. These are the lower jaws. These are used to measure the inner diameter of any, let's say, for example, a pipe or any circular object. Let's say, for example, you have a glass container. You want to measure the inside diameter. You can use the upper jaws to do that. The lower jaws will basically measure the outside or the outer diameter. All right. And then you have this little contraption right here, which is used to measure the depth. Again, of course, you cannot measure the depth of a well using this, but very small things like a test tube. So you want to measure the depth of a test tube, you can use it. All right. Now, what's the okay, actually okay. So what's the maximum that you can measure using a vernier caliper? That some vernier calipers are 10 centimeters, some are 20 centimeters. Again, a very accurate instrument that can measure, if I'm not wrong, up to 0.1 millimeters. All right. Yeah, so it can be accurate up to 0.1 millimeters, and it's the only instrument that you can use to measure the inner diameter. All right. No other instrument can easily, again, of course, you can bypass this stuff. You can use various different techniques to find out, but readily, any instrument, it's only the vernier caliper that you can use to measure the inside diameter. All right. So I hope that made sense. Then you have the micrometer screw gauge. All right, the micrometer screw gauge, again, it's even more accurate than your vernier caliper. So like it's written over here, that's the smallest division, 0.01 millimeter. Again, some have a maximum length of 5 centimeters or maybe 10 centimeters, but usually commercially available micrometers can measure up to 5 centimeters. All right, and it's accurate up to 0.01 millimeters, which is exactly 10 micrometers, and that's why we say that okay, it can measure in micrometers. All right, so this right here are the three instruments that you can use: vernier caliper, meter rule, micrometer, screw gauge, and then there is the measuring tape. All right, so you have measuring tape, either this right here, which you usually see used by tailors, and then you have this right here as a measuring tape as well. Usually you'd see people working like carpenters and other working people who will use this type of a measuring tape. Again, the smallest division is the same as the meter rule, but the idea is that now you can measure lengths of more than 100 centimeters accurately. So maximum length can be 50 meters, not 1 meter. Meter rule is 1 meter. Here it's 50 meters. All right. Advantages, of course, it's still cheap to make. It's not that so every advantage and disadvantage is going to be like the meter rule, except for the fact that it can now measure circular. So you have a tape, it's flexible, so now you can measure curved lengths. All right, so easy to manufacture, cheap, and it can measure curved lengths, and it's portable, of course. The disadvantage is again the same as the meter rule, that readings wear out over time and disappear. It's flexible. Now, because it's flexible, there might be a chance that the tape is not completely taut. Or let's say, for example, maybe you have this rod right here and you're measuring it using a tape, and then you started the tape over here, but then there's a bend in the tape like so. So this bend right here, this means that the tape is not held taut. All right, that's the term that we use. So again, this bend in the tape is going to give you an inaccurate result. All right, so again, this right here is all about how you're going to measure length. So the only real measurement that you can do is using meter rule, of course, at least what's in our course. You're not supposed to know how to use a vernier caliper. You're not supposed to know how to use a micrometer screw gauge. All right, but other than that, you should be able to use a meter rule, a measuring tape, so on and so forth. All right, so I hope that all of that made sense to everyone. That's it for this video, kids. Inshallah, I'll see you in the next one. Bars out.